are so many roguelike games out there that are considered great, and for good reason. But what makes a game great? What can separate it from others to where it gains a devoted fan base? This question has been asked a lot to me lately, as I've been playing this genre a lot more, and today I'm going to answer what I think makes a roguelike game great instead of good. And at the end of this video, I'm also going to say what I think the perfect roguelike game is, the game that checks out all the boxes. I will say I don't have the most experience with every game I mentioned, because a lot of these great roguelites can take well over 100 hours to even scratch the surface of the content available. And I don't have the time at the moment to dedicate hundreds of hours to multiple games. Oh, also lastly, these are my opinions, so please don't take it too seriously. I'm not trying to upset any fandoms or anything like that. Good general discussion in the comments will be good, but don't be attacking anybody, or me for that matter, for my own opinion. I just thought this would be a fun little video to make, so let's get into it. Of course, the most important thing that makes a game great is initial gameplay, but I'm gonna look beyond that for this video, as it's easy to say, Hades has fun gameplay, therefore it's the best. No, that's obvious. Gameplay as a whole will be looked at later in the video. With that behind us, let's jump into the second most important thing in what I think makes a roguelike game great, and that's general difficulty of the game, difficulty enhancers, and replayability all wrapped into one. Of course, replayability kind of goes in with gameplay, but whatever, just let's get into it. Most roguelike games end up being short in terms of a run, with being able to quote-unquote beat the game in 1 hour or less. And of course, most great games in this genre don't end after the first initial victory, but when a game is able to keep you engaged for multiple runs and the difficulty is enhanced fairly, that's one of the reasons for a roguelike success, in my opinion. You don't want the first run to be too hard, as then the player never gets to experience the enhancers. And I do know some games that suffer from being a little too hard on the player in the first run. They're still great games, but I don't find myself playing them too much. And my best example for that is Skull the Hero Slayer, which is a game I think is a fantastic roguelike with gameplay, soundtrack, item variety. But the biggest thing for Skull, and a few people in my Twitch chat have agreed with me on this, is the difficulty of the game. The game is incredibly hard to win, and you need to rely on getting some good RNG with a super insane build if you want to win yourself. I've played Skull for about 20 hours or so, and I've only ever gotten to the 3rd level of the game. Maybe I just stink, but who knows? I feel like Skull is a perfect example of a game that's too hard in the beginning. Maybe there's no difficulty enhancers after, or not a lot of story, but all I know is after 20 hours of going through the first 3 levels, I was getting a little sick of it. But if we look at great games with good difficulty modifiers, I feel there's 2 types of games to look at. The games that have your first run be very quick and have more of the game unlock as you keep completing runs, like Binding of Isaac, or have a Hades-esque where the run length is always the same, but you modify the difficulty to your liking. By the way, these 2 games will be examples a lot because they're both really good games that fill out like all the boxes, so just keep that in mind. In my opinion, those are the best ways to ensure good difficulty enhancers, and could argue the setup that a game like Isaac has is better, as you get new experiences more often with every run, compared to Hades where the game is just harder. But you still need to give Hades credit because you get to choose how difficult the game is, and I'm not the most knowledgeable person on Isaac for this example, but I'm only aware of like 3 or 4 different difficulty options for Isaac, which is nice, but not as much variety. Really, so many great games give you so many options with difficulty that help keep you, the player, engaged after your first initial run. It's one of the things that make a roguelike game great. It's not the most important thing though, but I'd say it could be like the second most important in my opinion. Next is something I was going to cover last, but decided that it's close in terms of importance with difficulty enhancers, and that's the story. I'll be honest, most of the roguelites I play, I'm not super invested into the story compared to a story-driven game like Horizon, and if a game has a good goal and the gameplay makes sense with it, that's a nice little bonus. One game I think of when talking about no story or goal for your characters is a game like Vampire Survivors. Yeah, it's one of the most popular games like ever, and it spawned a lot of bullet hell-esque survival games where you try to survive as long as possible. And don't get me wrong, I love Vampire Survivors. I can shut my brain off and just kill things really fast and get free dopamine. But to my knowledge, this game has no story whatsoever. If it does, I have no clue what it is, and I feel it was poorly explained, but it does almost everything else perfectly, which is why it's so highly rated, and why a story isn't that important in a great roguelike. It's nice to have, but in reality, it can just be a nice little bonus. Most great roguelike games do have a story, and the all-time great games do a great job at telling the story and pacing it over time. The story for Hades is so bittersweet and enjoyable. Granted, it can take a while and get tedious, but it's still a very well told story, and it helps enhance the already great game even more as you try to escape the underworld, find Zagreus' mother, and more. But then of course, there's still a lot of great games where you know what's happening with the story to an extent, but it's not your main focus or your main priority. I'll be honest, a game like that for me is Enter the Gungeon. Absolutely amazing game, but I'm not super well aware of the main story. I've killed the past with all the main characters, but don't really know what else is next. The gameplay is still so addicting and so much fun, but the story just takes a backseat for me. Really, it just shows that the story won't define or make a game's legacy. It's more so the combat and the gameplay that will do that. And this next part is probably the most important part of making a great roguelike game. Hell, making any great game. Hell, I did a poll on YouTube and this seems to have easily been the favorite. And like most of these topics, it helps make any game great, but fun combat and addicting gameplay, the most important aspect of any game, especially roguelites. With how much you'll be doing the same thing in these games, the combat really needs to draw you in and not be too complicated. Same with gameplay. I personally feel you don't want to spend too long on a tutorial and it can be more of a learn as you go. As always, Hades is a great example, as the first few runs in Hades you learn everything with boons, shops, different upgrades with currencies and everything, but it doesn't feel like a tutorial, it just draws you in. And when I think of great roguelites like that, I can think of so many great games that just throw you in the game and you just learn as you play. And that's what helps make a game great with its combat and gameplay. I can think of a lot of great games that when I played, I don't remember being stuck behind any tutorial, and if there was a tutorial, it didn't really seem like it. Vampire Survivors is another great example where you just learn as you play the game, and that is some of the most addicting gameplay I've ever done. You just shut your brain off and go. FTL is a great example of a game that has a super quick tutorial, but it packs so much content in such a short amount of time, and FTL is one of the most addicting strategy games I've ever played. If you like strategy, you'll like FTL. All of the proclaimed best roguelites ever have some of the most addicting and satisfying combat and gameplay I've ever played. I feel like I don't need to touch more on this subject. You know how important gameplay is, and so many great roguelike games have such addicting gameplay. I could name games for days. Enter the Gungeon, Rogue Legacy 2, Dead Cells, everything. Returnal, there's so many games. I don't need to keep going. Now we have the last super important part of making any roguelike game great, in my opinion. Of course, there's a lot of smaller things you could talk about, like music, atmosphere, maybe graphics are important to you, length of a run, too much RNG, hell, maybe you like achievements. But I don't think all of those need a talking point, because then we'd be here forever. Those are small little bonuses, but the last super important part of making a great roguelike game, in my opinion, is item variety, which can lean into gameplay and replayability, but I view item variety as a major positive. A game that has a lot of different weapons, upgrades, and even player buffs will make you want to keep playing and try to master everything. I can name so many roguelites that have kept me so interested with their way of adding variety to the game with items, and the items make you strategize more, play more, everything. Darkest Dungeon's a good example. It has 17 different characters or so, all with different attacks, and so many different enemies, all with different attacks, which makes you need to have so much strategizing for the game. And then on top of that, it has trinkets, which will buff your characters. Really, Darkest Dungeon does it good with just all the characters alone. Another great example, Skull the Hero Slayer. Tough game, like I said, but the player upgrades and all the different skulls that change how your skull work, they're done so well and helped keep my interest in the game high when I was playing. Sadly, I sucked at it. Binding of Isaac, a lot of people's favorite game. One of the most original roguelike games you can play. It might do this better than any game. Almost 1,000 achievements on Steam, tons of different characters you can unlock, all with different starting health or weapons or speed, so many different items that change your character with buffs, so many items that can follow you around as an ally, pills that can buff you, cards that can teleport you or help you out in a pinch. So many great roguelites have so much variety, whether it be upgrades, items, player buff, and it's a reason why a lot of the games succeed. It helps keep the player engaged. So many great roguelites have so much variety with player buffs, weapons, upgrades, different characters you can start with, all with different stats. It's one of the reasons why these games succeed so well, and it's one of the reasons why I end up playing them for so many hours. One of the best roguelites of 2022 is Rogue Legacy 2, and they excel in this area so well with the upgrade tree that you have, and a wide variety of characters, armor, and other items. Personally, for me, this is one of the most important aspects in making a great roguelike. And like all the other sections I talked about, I could name games for days that keep you engaged with so much weapon variety, and it's amazing to see. That's what I think makes a roguelike game great. But after all of that, what's the perfect roguelike game? What's the game that excels in everything that I mentioned above? Well, we know it's not Skull the Hero Slayer. That game's too hard in the first run. It has good item variety and skill upgrades, but it's not the perfect game. You'll probably say Darkest Dungeon's my perfect game as it's my favorite, and you'd be wrong. It's my favorite game for sure, but it has its flaws with how much RNG is in the game and how long a run can take. I know I said those type of things aren't as important, but they still play a factor. I just didn't fully dive into them. But because of that, Darkest Dungeon is not the perfect roguelike. Maybe Hades? Well, Hades is damn near perfect in every way if you ask me. The combat is so satisfying, the upgrade system with the mirror is incredible, the weapons all have 4 different variations, and then there's tons of boons that play well together, giving you an endless amount of replayability. And then the difficulty enhancers are incredible. But what really sets it apart is how tedious it can end up being if you want to 100% the game. I love the game, but trying to reach the epilogue or even having the credits roll can take a while, and you might take some breaks here and there. Okay, I did 3 examples. What's the perfect roguelike game already? In reality, it could be whatever game you want it to be. what game fills all those boxes well? Hades is the closest one for me, and in my eyes is the perfect roguelike. But for you, it could be Binding of Isaac with its difficulty, story, items, simple yet addicting combat. Or maybe it's Dead Cells for you, which I didn't even mention in this video, but it also does everything amazing. The upgrade system is incredible, the combat is hard but so addicting, so many different items and different runs you have. Really, the game does it so well. In the end, there's so many amazing roguelike games that you can play, and maybe your favorite game isn't the same as someone else's, but with the amount of incredible games in this genre, you can have a backlog of games for years to come like me. Just don't take anything too personally. Everybody likes different video games, and that's okay. But I appreciate you watching this video, and I'm a little nervous to upload it as I usually just talk about one game at a time instead of a topic like this, but let me know what you think in the comments below. Like and subscribe, of course, if you like the video, and big shout out to the people that support me on Patreon. I wish I could give them more content, but I stream 5 days a week on Twitch and I edit videos when I can. I'm one guy doing my best, but I appreciate the support always and the patience. Thanks for watching again, and see you next time.